Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about the Greek diaspora in Belgium, also referred to as the Greek community in Belgium or the Hellenic community in Belgium. Historically speaking, there are four distinct periods of migration of Greeks from Greece or other parts of Europe towards this country. One starts before 1956, which we collectively could call the prehistory of the Hellenic community, where only individual cases are reported. Then we have the main period of mass migration of 1956 and up to the early 70s, followed by the 80s and the 90s, where the purpose of the relocation was mainly work in the European institutions. And then we have another wave at the early 2010 decade for economic purposes as a result of the financial crisis in Greece. Let's start with the first historical period, that's before 1956. We could generally say that anyone who has arrived between the formation of the Kingdom of Belgium in 1830 and the signature of the bilateral agreement between the Kingdom of Belgium and the Kingdom of Greece at that time for the mass relocation of labor force arrived in Belgium mainly for the purposes of commerce, in the context of mixed marriages, or in the context of the First World War. They were in the realm of some hundreds, not thousands, but we already know that those who came later recorded their existence and in many cases seek their advice, guidance, or help with the issues upon arrival. The second period is that of the mass labor migration. What happened was that in the course of the 50s, the 60s, and the early 70s, there was demand for unskilled labor, basically for the coal mines in Belgium, and on the other hand, there was supply in Greece, especially in the rural areas, where Belgian recruiters arrived and practically recruited some of the population to move to Belgium with the promise of fixed, secure labor and a better life in another country. How was that possible? Greece was just out of a devastating World War II and a civil war that left marks, both politically, socially, and economically, to the country that were not healed, not even in the 80s. During that period, the Greek community started taking shape. Something like 20,000 Greeks have arrived, and they settled around the cities of Brussels, Charleroi, Mons, Liège, and Antwerp. They also started working, mainly in the coal mines. The work was tough, but the situation in Greece was even harder for them. It was a situation that they fled from, so they cherished their newfound life in the country, no matter the difficulties, and started rebuilding their lives. The integration of the society was not seamless, but it was easier than others. There was a state-approved bilateral agreement that dealt with the administrative difficulties, and then integration of the society had only one big issue, the language barrier. But eventually the Greeks learned French and Dutch in the cases and integrated as well as they could, gradually moving from their initial job positions in the mines, first to the factories and then into commerce and the field of entertainment, restaurants. In terms of numbers, we could say that only 3% of all those who migrated from Greece to continental Europe at that time arrived in Belgium. Out of the 20,000 that finally settled, some 30% returned to Greece before 1965. But they were always replenished by new Greeks arriving, settling, following the procedures, and going back. An average term could span from 10 years of labor and up to his whole working life. Communication and connection with the rural communities they left behind was not that easy. Telephones were not frequent, letters took time, and traveling was extremely expensive. With the connection in Greece severed, the community started forming its distinct identity. People who remembered how things were in the old country trying to reproduce them in the new country. They formed circles around mainly the Orthodox Church and the community services. They held fests, and they tried to perpetuate what they perceived as traditionally Greek. That did not apply to politics, since almost everyone was trying from the mid-70s and up to the year 2000 to organize and reproduce the political ideas or even the political parties that were operating in metropolitan Greece. That re-established the connection of those residing in Belgium and those residing in Greece, at least at the political field. The parties took advantage, and in the 80s, what we could call electoral tourism actually flourished. People who had the right to vote started visiting Greece more often, and more often for every electoral occasion there was. That did not go very well. The Greeks who arrived in the 80s and the 90s in the context of the European Union were educated, they held university degrees, and eventually became far wealthier than their counterparts of the 50s and the 60s. Eventually, a division was formed in the community where the old Greeks did not accept the new ones as real immigrants. A real immigrant is someone who struggles, who went through the coal mines, who went to the factories, and made his way into the Belgian way of life. On the other hand, the so-called Eurocrats did not also mix very well with the old community. They lived in another world. Their kids went to separate schools, the European schools, and they did not have barriers in forming other kinds of relations with other communities of similar expats, as they call themselves. That was more or less the situation up to the year 2000. Then something started to change. The kids that were born after the mid-70s started around 2000 to seek quality university postgraduate education, something that was not offered in Greece. Some of them eventually arrived in Belgium. They stayed in the country for fixed periods of time, then started seeking jobs, and more or less they were at the realm of hundreds. The second change had to do with the economic and financial crisis of 2010. In the year 2010, Greece went bankrupt. There was a financial crisis and eventually a recession. Demand for employment was not there anymore, so people had to travel to Europe to find a job. Of course, they did not arrive all at once. They arrived the best part of 2010 to 2015, seeking better employment conditions and higher wages, not only to live their lives, but in some cases to finance their taxes back in the home country. Some might say that the 1950s are all over again, but no, there is no real comparison between what happened in the 1950s and the wave of 2010, at least in terms of communication, ease of travel, wage levels, and the general perception of what the community is and what an individual in a community could or should do between the two cases. Finally, we could say that when we talk about the Greek communities in Belgium, we are really talking about four distinct historical periods where Greeks arrive for different reasons, but always employment being one of them, and remain in the country for quite different periods. A Eurocrat returns to Greece when he retires and receives his pension. Typically, a Greek from the previous migration era remains in the country for the rest of his life. A student might remain in the country 2 or 3 years maximum after the time of his graduation seeking employment. And for the Greeks of the financial crisis of 2010, it remains to be seen. In any case, all of them understand their self and the community in totally different terms. And that's what matters. There is also another group of Greeks in Belgium. They are the journalists, those who report for the European institution. I did not cover them in this presentation because they are a very small group, and historically there have never been more than, let's say, 12 to 16 individuals at a time. As for how they feel in terms of integration, community, Greece in Belgium, and so forth, I'm gonna grab my Trappist beer and fries and tell you later.